Shem HaTefilah, Amud Tefilah, the pillar of prayer. So this is from the Toldos Yaakov Yosef, one of the primary students of the Baal Shem, and it's Ois, entry, Lamed Hey. Shemaiti Amari, I heard from my teacher, from my master, that a person has to strengthen themselves before they start praying, in order for them to be able to pray with moichin, with expansive mind, expansive state of consciousness, without any intruding thoughts or unwanted thoughts. And what's the definition of praying, davening with moichin? What's the definition of that? That a person is able to daven and says he has an expansive consciousness. This means that a person is able to daven, a person is able to pray without any machshavas. That means without any other intruding thoughts, as much as possible. That the person is able to concentrate, hold their concentration to exactly what they're speaking about, to exactly what they're talking in their words of the davening, and without any other thoughts. And how do you do that? So there are some people, or sometimes, this is a very classic way of the way the Baal Shem Tov looks at life. And he says there is no particular regimen. There's no path, a specific path. He says there are sometimes, through a person saying Tehillim, chapters in Psalms, or reading Torah, learning Torah, that that brings moichin, that opens up the mind, that focuses the mind in a way, expands the heart, opens the heart, expands the mind, opens the mind, that when they're able to, when they start to daven, right, immediately when they start praying, they have clarity of mind, and they can daven with proper machshava, proper thought process. So the introduction, or the introductory way to get into that place is through saying Tehillim, or through learning Torah. V'yesh, and there are those people that it doesn't work that way. It's possible that it's there are other people that if they're going to learn Torah, or they're going to say Tehillim, they're going to say chapters of Psalms before davening, that in itself is going to get them into a right state of moichin, a right state of expansive mind, and then when they're going to start davening, it's not going to work. They're going to lose their moichin, they're going to lose their expansive mind. So therefore the Baal Shem says, therefore echad ha-magba v'echad ha-mamit v'vad sheyichavan libnei shmashamayim. That's what Chazal say, the sages say, the Gemara says, Menachos, both the person that extends and says more, both the person that says less, the main thing is that the person should have intentions to heaven. So the Taz famously asked the question, in the beginning of Shulchan Aruch says, if so, why does it say echad ha-mamit, both the person that is can say more, can say less? If it's talking about a person that it could be mechavan l'shem shamayim, that could have his mind for intention of heaven, so let it be more. So the Baal Shem says we're not talking about a person that's davening in itself. We're not speaking about in prayer itself. We're talking about how you enter into davening. Now the question is, how do you enter? Well, some people, this will help them enter into the proper state of consciousness, and some people, something else. And the truth is, every single person, there's certain times of their lives, during certain times of their life period, one way will work, one way will allow them to induce themselves into a higher state of consciousness, a more expansive state, and sometimes something else. And even throughout a person's day, there are certain times, certain days that a person will be one way, and certain times a person will be another way. And within the day itself, there's certain times one davening will be this way, one davening this way. And the truth is, like the Chayzer Lublin once said, the klal in avodas Hashem, this is a very Hasidic interpretation, the klal in avodas Hashem, the basic principle in all service of Hashem, which means all open, alive serving of God, serving of Hashem, and being alive to life, is shtak in klalim. There's no principles. On der klal is nicht klal, and even this principle is not a principle, which means every single moment, every single day is a new day. The Arizal says that every single davening that we daven is a new davening. The Baal Shem says every single davening that we daven have new machshavas, new intruding thoughts. So therefore, you have to gauge yourself. You have to be honest about yourself, and you have to say, I'm in the mood now. Do I feel this expansive mind? Which means, does it allow me? Am I able to now focus for extended periods of time, or right when I start thinking about starting to daven, immediately I'm thinking about what am I going to have for breakfast, or where I'm going to have to go to after I daven, and who do I have to meet today, and what's my business encounters, and maybe what I have to learn today. If that's the way you start davening, maybe you have to start entering and start saying Tillim or learning Torah to open your mind. If you wake up in the morning and you're on fire and you feel clarity and you feel an expansive mind, so then daven right away. So every single person has to engage their lives exactly how they're experiencing in the moment. And therefore he says that this is the next entry, that for some people really entering lo yarba harbit chodim at Tefilah, a person shouldn't sometimes try to pray with a lot of intention, to enter into prayer with a lot of intention through saying Tillim, with a lot of their strength of being, because then sometimes that could cause a person to become tired, and when a person has become tired, they're not going to be able to daven. So again, it's the same idea. He says generally this is the way it is to learn how to pace yourself. He says like Yom Kippur, when you know that soon you want to daven Ne'ilah, this is also another way of thinking about it, is to understand that if you're going to put a lot of strength in what you're doing right now, it's possible you're not going to have strength for something that's going to be a little later on. So let's say you're in the middle of Yom Kippur, he gives an example, and you're in the middle of reciting after the Avodah, you're saying the Piyutim, some of the hymns, and it's already late in the afternoon, and you're already getting tired, so you're going to put a lot of energy into saying that correctly with a lot of intention. That's maybe not going to, that's going to distract or going to take away from the koyach that you're going to have later on to daven Nilo, to pray Nilo. This is maybe daven that pekatnus, simple intention, just to understand the Pirush Hamillah is exactly what you're saying. Of course, you don't want to say things that are nonsensical, to know exactly what you're saying, and then later you're going to daven with it more godless. Okay, this similar teachings that he has the next few about if there's a Sharas HaShechina before, if there's the presence of the Shechina before you start davening or after you start davening, how exactly it works. And then he says it suggests that you should learn Zohar or learn Chassidus before davening for these reasons. Again, these are all ways to enter into the proper state of davening, to really engage yourself and think about, am I now in an expansive state, and could I daven now in a correct way that I can daven with no machshavas zars, without intruding thoughts. And that's a way to gauge whether your level of consciousness is clear, whether you have expansive or constricted consciousness, whether you can concentrate for longer periods of time. Here's another teaching, Lamentes 39, from Tefilah Rivash, also from Tefilah Rivash. So Shem says, a person should be careful, Yizar, that a person should be careful to always daven by the nets. The nets is in the morning, when night is turning into day, that you should always try to pray at that particular time. That a person should say most of the davening, which means the Tehillim and all the verses of Psalms, up until Shema, until the nets, and then they should start to say the Mumichama. This is the Gemara says this also, but the Baal Shem says it gives it a little twist. He says because the difference between before and after the nets, before it becomes light and after it becomes light, is the difference between the difference between the east and the west. It's a very big difference. Because before that, before night turns into day, and particularly during this sort of this twilight time, that it's after Dal Ice, before nights, which means that it's sort of light, but the sun hasn't yet risen, and you don't see yet the sun, so it's sort of this twilight time. He says at that time it's much easier for a person to nullify levatal adinim min hakol. That a person can nullify the din, the judgments that exist within the world, as it says in the pasuk, that's when it gets when it becomes in the morning. Then there's heat. Heat also can be wrath or anger. So that represents the time of judgment. So before the world fills with this type of reality, a person should start to daven. And he says this is very important And the Baal Shem himself was very medactic, very careful to daven at this time, to pray during this twilight time in the morning. And even if if he didn't have a minyan, he would even daven biyichidus, he would even daven alone during this time. Let's try to understand what the Baal Shem is saying, because on a simple level, the Gemara speaks about that davening vasikin. The Gemara speaks about many times about the value of davening with the sun that's rising. But the Baal Shem has a more inner reason for this purpose of why we should try to daven during this time period. So there is day and there's night, and generally night is considered a time of din, time of judgment. The day is considered more a time of chesed. That's general. Shem Adna, Shem Yekivavke, but in general, that's the difference between the night and the day. Because night represents a time of lack of clarity, and day represents a time of clarity. But there's another element over here, which is that during the day, when people are awake, certainly this goes back to time periods where there weren't, artificial lighting, there weren't street lights, etc., or lights in the home. Everything was done with candles, with kerosene. So night was a time that people generally slept. Day was generally a time that people were awake and worked in the fields or worked, the world of commerce. So during the day, what happens when people wake up in the morning, what's happening in the world, or at least your world where you're experiencing the sunrise, is that now the world becomes filled with a particular type of metaphysical noise, literal noise, but also a metaphysical noise. Chazal talk about, the sages, the Gemara speaks in Yuma about different types of sounds. That there's the koil, there's the sound of koil amoinu sharoimi, there's the sound of Rome, which is the sound of trying to make money and commerce, that cancels out the more subtle sounds of a mother giving birth to a child. And there's a deep reading also. The Medrash brings down the sound of the kol, the sound of the celestial spheres. That there is various different subtle sounds, spiritual sounds, inner sounds that are canceled out by outer sounds. So what it means is when the world is awake, the world is filled with a type of not necessarily a negative sound, but it's not a spiritual elevated sound. It's possible, of course, if you're living in a very elevated place and everyone has elevated thoughts and words and actions, this place will be an elevated place. But if you're living in a general, wherever you're living generally, in a general place where people are let's say in a mediocre state, what's happening is that in the day, once people start awakening, there's sort of a release of toxicity, like spiritual toxicity of arrogance and ego and power and fight that enters into the world because people are having these thoughts, speaking these words, doing these actions, and that sort of muddies the world. That's the din of the world. That's the world of the judgment. That's the world of concealment. So Baal Shem says that what you want to do is you want to start davening. You want the davening that you're davening now, the prayers that you're speaking should come before that. So the first sounds should be clear. This is why other tzaddikim speak about the idea of having his badanos or his badanos. A person should contemplate to themselves or to be with themselves. Either it's in the middle of the night or very early in the morning. It's all because of the same idea. It's before the noise of the world will cancel out the more inner subtle noises. So you want to tap into the place that's before the din, and therefore you can create new realities. That's possible to break the din on a deeper level. This is also consistent with the teaching that we learned before, where the Baal Shem Tov talked about a few pages before, from Kesser Shem Tov, where the Baal Shem Tov talked about that a person has to be very careful about the first thoughts that they have in the morning, and the first words that they speak, and the first actions that a person takes, because every single thought that you will have will be predicated and based and founded on the first thought that you had in the morning. Every single word that you're going to speak will be founded and based on the first words that you speak, and an action the same way. So this is another way of saying it. The Baal Shem is saying is that if you can catch that moment where night is turning into day, where the moment is now arising, in that particular moment, right when it's arising, if you can give voice, holy voice, and speak holy words of Torah, holy words of prayer, what you're doing is that you're creating the foundation of the reality that you're living in, at least in your 4 cubits, in the world that you're living in your universe, is that everything that will happen throughout the day, all the sounds that will be perpetuated throughout the entire day from the entire world that's surrounding you will all be founded on the pure and holy noble words that you spoke in the words of prayer and davening. So it's not only about, because the world is already filled, but it's sort of therefore this can be like you have to struggle harder to have clear thoughts and to have clear words, because not only do we struggle with our own thoughts, but on a more subtle level, we actually pick up other people's energy, as it were, other people's thoughts, maybe not consciously or subconsciously or subliminally or by osmosis. We pick up other people's sensations and feelings about themselves, and we ingest them, we take them in, and then we struggle ourselves to have proper thoughts, to have proper words. So you want to get to that point in the early morning, before the world is filled with all this noise, and people are still asleep, and people are not proactively creating these negative forces in the universe, so you can create positivity in this world for yourself and for the world around you. And not only that all the thoughts and all the actions, all the words that will come out throughout the entire day will be predicated and founded on these words that you say. That's another point. So this is another point that Baal Shem is saying. A third point that he's saying is that it's a time period which is a liminal time period, it's a transitional time period. So generally, transitional time periods are very, very important and marked. This could be transitional time periods within spaces that are in between Kodesh L'Chol, between sacred and the mundane. And it could be also in terms of time, that between sacred time, which let's say Shabbos, and Chol on the weekdays. Then there's that liminal space, which is the Taisa Shabbos, the added to Shabbos. Even in every single day, there are these time periods of transitions. Now, there's a transition that happens throughout the day. There are many different types of transitions. There's a transition, and every single transition has to be marked. There's a transition where night became already day. And if you're not davening Vasiki, you're not davening very early. So that's marked by the morning prayers, by Shachars. Then there's the period which is Mincha Ketana, which is the proper time to daven Mincha. Mincha Doyle is only if you b'diavad, according to Rambam, but it's the proper real time would be Mincha Ketana, which is the transition time where evening is approaching. So you're transitioning from a place of work into a place of going home. That's the Mincha time period. And then Ma'ariv is a Ma'ariv Rav, which is already night, which is already transitioned from day to night, and therefore is also marked by davening. But then there's even a more interesting time period throughout the day, which is the time period which is the in-between time, which Chazal, the sages call this time Ben Hashmashas, between the suns, the sun being the sun and the moon. Between the suns, this happens generally during the most familiar is the one that happens Ben Hashmashas, is where it's moving from day to night. And in that time, it is a big machlokes, a three argument in Gemara and Shabbos, what exactly, how long this time period is. And there's a famous argument in the Goyim and Rabbeinu Tam. But there's the minimal amount of time period of this Bein Hashmashas between these time periods is that it's Geharifayat. It's very, very quick, which means that this time period is like the blink of an eye. And the way it's phrased, this transitional period, is that either it's a suffix, it's a doubt whether it's a day or it's a night, suffix yom or suffix laila, it's a doubt whether it's a day or doubt whether it's a night, or it's a suffix yom v'laila, or it's a suffix, maybe it's a doubt that it's day and night, or it's a suffix that it's not lo yom v'lo laila, that it's not day and it's not night. That's the deeper way of Rakachav, and others read that it represents a nakuda point that holds the space that has the potential to rise both for day and night. That's the ultimate transitional period. In these transitional periods, that happens in the evening, which is when the sun is setting and it's about to become night. It also happens in the morning, where it's before nates, it's before the sun rises. It's sort of dark and light. There's already a lois. This represents a type of liminal transitional period. And in transitional periods is a very, very powerful time because not only do they have to be marked, like explained, that they have to be marked because that's where you transition correctly from one space to next or from one time to next by marking that space, a bar mitzvah or a bris or upshurn. Every time there's, and throughout life is always marked, the transitions are marked. But it's not about marking the transitions, but it's also about being present in that transition place because that transitional place has a lot of power because it's not the old and it's not yet the new. So the old already has a certain surah, a certain form that it represents what it is and what it was, actually what it was. The present moment that's already arising, let's say you'll have night represents what night is, day represents what day represents, and then there's the liminal time, the transitional period, which is not day and not night, so it doesn't have this definition or that definition. And not only is it defined by being both that definition and that definition, which is Yom and Laila, but its definition is that it's not day and it's not night, which means that it's something that stands outside of time, so to speak. It's a spark of infinity. It's a spark of infinity that cannot be quantified. You can't call it day and you can't call it night. In that spark of infinity, and of course this is clarifying, the moment you try to grasp it, it's already the past. But in this liminal moment, in this transitional moment, we can actually create the greatest power because we have the power of something that's infinite. That's not defined by being day and it's not defined by being night. And I think this is also what the Baal Shem is teaching. The Baal Shem is teaching that when you get to that place of the nekuda, the place of that point, therefore when you get to the place of the point, that's a very important place where a person has tremendous amount of power to actually create something from an infinite space that's not defined by the past and not defined yet by the future. And this seems to be also what the Baal Shem is saying at the end, when it says at the teaching, the way it's written, the way it's given over in Tefilah Rivash, is in the testimony of the Baal Shem, is that it's written that the Baal Shem himself used to be careful to daven this way, even if there was no minyan. What does that mean? Now, there's halachic precedence for that, to daven without a minyan, when you want to daven Masikin, when you want to daven this early. But if that's the custom that you generally daven, you always daven Masikin. But there's something deeper and connected to what we just said, is that the Baal Shem is saying that the difference between a single person and a person with a minyan and a person that's the difference between a prat and a klal, between a specific and a general, is only in the world of tzura, in the world of form, that the individual is either an individual separate from 10 other people, and he's not with a minyan, or he is with the minyan. But from the place of the nekuda that contains both lo yom v'lo laila, yom and laila, day and night, and not day and not night, in the place of infinity, he's actually tapping into the place of the nekuda, the place of the point, and in that place of the point, it includes all people simultaneously, because in the place of the nekuda, everyone's mischaver, everyone becomes as one. This is something very profound to meditate on and to think about. This comes from Tefilah Rivash, and this is Ois Lametes. Okay, we'll continue a little bit more. Ois Mem. Says the Baal Shem, B'Shem Baal Shem, that the reason why it's brought down in Gemara, the Gemara brings it down in Brachos, Chavchas, and the Shulchan Aruch, that a person that is, let's say a person is not capable, or it's mahalik mil, whatever, a person cannot get to shul, cannot pray with a minyan. And let's say you're living in a town, and there's one minyan, and the minyan davens at 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever the time is, that's the minyan time that it davens. So the Gemara says, sages say that you should not pray. Also, you should not pray before the tzibur prays. So if the tzibur, the collective, in shul, they daven at 8 o'clock, you should try not to daven at 7:30. And best, like brought down in Shulchan Aruch, you should actually try to daven exactly the same time that they're davening, if you cannot get to shul, being not a shachan ra. Says the Baal Shem, what's the deeper reason for this? This is a very little bit of cryptic statement, but this is what he says: Shu koidim ratzin v'askama sevarim. because this is before the desire and the consent of the organs of the body. What does this mean? There's a lot of ways to think about exactly what this means, but let's try to understand one path to understand this. The Baal Shem has spoken, and we've already learned many times, that the Shekhinah is a divine presence within this world, a specific divine presence in the world. And the Shekhinah can be in a state of Sukkos Davar HaTefilah, can be in a state of fall, or it can be in Haracham of Yakim Lanu, it can be in a state of uprightness. The Shekhinah is the divine presence within creation. And sometimes the divine presence in creation is shining correctly. When the Shekhinah shines correctly, we spoke about this a few times previously, what that means is that everything is working in its optimum state. The Shekhinah represents Malchus, the world of the container, what's holding the presence of the Creator, of the Creator's light, of the Ein Sof. So when a person has, let's say we'll talk about, and if you think about it in terms of a marriage, so Chazal say that if a person has a healthy, good marriage, so then the Shekhinah Shoira B'neihem, the Shekhinah rests in the home, which means if you walk into a home, and the home is lichtig, is lit up, is saturated with love and acceptance, and everyone's joyful in the house, and the parents love each other, and the children love each other, and respectful, and it's beautiful, the home is immaculate, and everything looks beautiful and correct. Well, when you enter such a home, you say, the Shekhinah is resting in this home, which means that this space is where the Shekhinah is in its perfect manifestation. It's showing itself correctly in its correct form. God forbid you see something that is hurt, injured, broken, or God forbid even worse, but let's say you see even a tree that's a sick tree. The tree that's sick is the presence of the Shekhinah now in a state of exile. Because the Shekhinah's light, when the Shekhinah's light will be revealed into this world in its correct form, in its ultimate form, and Yakim Lanu Sukkos Davar HaTefilah will be in its correct form, the Shekhinah Tata, Shekhinah Elah, the highest level of Shekhinah will be present in this world, everything will be perfect. Every tree will be healthy. Every animal will be healthy. Everything will be in its perfect state. Everyone will have parnasa, livelihood. Everyone will have shidduchim, will be happily married. Everyone will have good children. Everyone will have perfection. All illnesses will be healed. That's the light of the Shekhinah will be. If the world will shine, maybe that's the correct word. If the world will shine in its correct way, everything in the world will be perfect. When you see the imperfection, that means that there's a defect, there's an exile, there's a concealment of the Shekhinah's light. That the Shekhinah's light is not penetrating through this thing. There's pekakim, there's concealments, and there's blockages that are now allowing the Shekhinah. It's like sort of to say that if a person has, God forbid, a limb on their body that is unhealthy, it's because the blood circulation is not flowing correctly. So therefore, the body part the limb of the body is an unhealthy condition. Which means when the body is functioning correctly, when all the blood and the oxygen is distributed throughout the body in the correct way, and the person is functioning in the correct way, then this body is correct. Now let's understand what this means in terms of what he's saying about davening. There's a teaching that's brought down b'Shem Baal Shem. The Maggid brings it down that Knesset Yisrael, that we are the Avara Shekhinah. We are sort of the limbs of the Shekhinah. So to imagine this in a super high level, which is brought down by the Arizal in Shar Gugulim, but this is also actually a medrash by Sarabah, that Klal Yisrael can be seen as one body. So there's Shasha and Neshama, the people and the souls that come from the head, from the eyes, from the nose, from the ears, different body parts. Different souls come from different body parts. But collectively, there's a sheer kaima, there's one structure. This is obviously not on a literal level at all, but to understand this in terms of this metaphor, that there are certain souls that are connected to the eyes, certain to the intelligence, certain souls that are connected to the heart. And collectively, we are the Evora Shekhinah. We're sort of the limbs of the Shekhinah. And when Klal Yisrael is in its perfect state, when everyone's doing Torah mitzvahs and doing it correctly and doing it with ava and besimcha, and everyone is lichtig and everyone's alive and illuminated and enlightened and everyone is in that perfect state, then the Yevora Shechina is in a very healthy state, and that means that the Shir Koima is functioning in a correct manner, and then as a manifestation and a ripple effect of that, the whole world enters into a higher state of reality. Now, when a person's davening, when a person's praying, what they're really asking for is, they're asking, let's say a person is praying for parnasa, for livelihood. Let's say there's a person that's struggling with making a living, and you're praying for this individual. So what you're praying for, you're not asking for physicality. What you're asking for is that the presence of the Shekhinah's light should be revealed correctly in this person's life, and that translated, the shefa, the translation of that shefa, of that flow, the divine flow is the giving flow of life. When a person doesn't have parnasa, or a person is ill, a person is sick, which means that the shefa, the divine flow of that's mahava, machayim, makayim, that gives life and sustains life at every single moment and continues to mischadish at every single moment, to continues to give life, is not flowing correctly. What you're doing in davening, which we spoke about very often, is that what you're doing is you're connecting yourself with the or, connecting yourself with the source of the shefa, and now you're opening up the channels through the actually speaking to create new channels of light, that the light of the shefa should come down. And because the light of the shefa, the light of the giving force of the divine, of the Ein Sof, the infinite light of Hashem, is to give life, to give chayes, to give animation. When you open up these channels and these pathways, now this person all of a sudden has this light, and the light translates as the person has joy and has correct livelihood and has health, etc., etc. Everything starts working in its correct form. So you're actually what you're davening for, and what you're creating in the process of davening, of praying, is the opening of the shefa to be received, to flow down into the entire Yevora Shechina. So into the entire limbs of the Shechina. Because if we use this analogy, I don't know if it's such a correct analogy, but something similar to this. It's I don't know, but it's a funny analogy. But let's think about this analogy. Let's say you have to blow up a balloon that has a configuration of a human being. Let's say. So we'll use this analogy. So the configuration of the human being is like the body, the Ivarim, the limbs of the limbs, and then the life force, which is the oxygen that you blow in, the breath that you blow into this balloon, is what gives animation and gives life, vitality to this body. When a person is davening, what you're asking for is from the Ein Sof, from the infinite light, that it should blow in, like we spoke before, from the Hevel Elyon, from the divine animating life force of giving. There should be a divine exhale to give oxygen, to give life to this entire balloon, so to speak, to the entire Yevora Shechina, to the physicality of this world, and we're the limbs of the Shechina to all ourselves, our physical selves. And everything should become animated. So let's use this analogy. The only way you could, it's the asking for davening b'yechid is davening alone before the klal, the tzibur, the collective is davening, is sort of trying to blow up a balloon that has the structure of a body, but only fill the air with the left finger, for example. Let's say you are the Yevora Shechina, you're one of the limbs of the Shechina, and you're the left finger. And you want your life to be filled with life and oxygen and giving and divine life force, which will give you sustenance and health and happiness and joy and everything that you need in this world. And you're trying to draw down that energy and you're the little left finger in the metaphor of that's the Shoyesh and Hashem, and that's where your root soul comes from that place. So it would be, for example, like trying to blow up this balloon or trying to blow an oxygen through the process of davening and speaking the words and breathing out the words. It would be similar to trying to blow into the oxygen and create a flow to that right finger or left finger within the balloon. it wouldn't work. The only way to do it is the only way that this little finger can get wind and can get oxygen. And again, we're using this as a metaphor, is if there is a blowing of the entire balloon, and then it fills out, and then it fills out even into the fingers, then everything receives life. So this is what the Baal Shem was saying. You could, but not in this correct way, not the way the Baal Shem is understanding of Tefilah on the highest level. You can't fill the balloon only in the specific place. First, you have to fill up the entirety of the Avar Eshchina. All the Avar Eshchina has to be filled with life. And then it'll manifest from this cloud, from this great principle, from this great overarching thematic light that comes into this world, will now trickle down into all the details. So he's saying you can't speak about a detail, a specific thing that wants a little bit light to be drawn into it without first filling the entirety, and then from the entirety it's spilling out and moving in all the directions. And that's what he says. It needs first the haskamas of all the avarim has to be part of the process. Davening with a tzibur, davening with tzaddikim, bein and rishayim, the idea of davening together with 10 represents symbolically also the 10 spheres. It represents the combination of all different types of possible people. When you daven as a collective, what you're doing is you're saying in a minor form and in a microscopic form, this collective of these 10 people now represent the entirety of Klal Yisrael. So that's what the Baal Shem Tov says. Okay, that's Mem. Then the next few, Mem Aleph and Mem Beis, Mem Gimel, he just talks about, he speaks about that it's a chesed, it's a kindness that you survive after davening, if you really daven with a higher kavanah. He speaks about how a person can daven with such intention that they feel like they're expiring. Okay, we're just going to do one more other teaching from the Baal Shem. And this is as follows. Hamedaber b'loi machshava u'kamoi moitze zer levatala. Someone that speaks without intention, without mindful intention, which means you're saying words, you're speaking, but it's levatala, you're speaking empty words. B'loi machshava, without actually intention, mindful intention. It's like wasting seed. Rahman al-Islam. Let's just read what he says, and then we'll understand what it means. Ki machshava is al-adam hu kshir koima shlema. Because machshava for a person is an entire structure. Proof is, proof is that a person has thoughts while they're intimate with their spouse. They can create an exchange child. We'll explain what this means. And if he doesn't have thoughts, is en kishalodas. If he doesn't have thoughts, any yachal is avik. If he doesn't have even thought what he's doing, he cannot perform. A male cannot perform. So everything comes from the machshava, from the thought. Va'machshava hu achachma. Machshava is the chachma, is the wisdom. Va'dibur, and the speech is the haylada, is the actual child. So there's the creative process, and then what is created. The creative process is the thought process, and the words are the children of your thoughts. Because even in thoughts, there is words, and then when you speak those words, you're giving birth to the thought that you had within your mind. Therefore, he continues. Therefore, when a person doesn't think what they're saying, then they're like moitze zer levatala. They are like wasting their seed, physical seed. Shadibur ha'chaisla, because the person's dibur is his life force. What does this mean? This means it's like this. There are two, the Sefer Tzir speaks about this, that there is the bris ha'ma'or and the bris ha'lashon. There's a covenant that's connected to the procreative organ, and there's a covenant created, there's a bris, also the society to the lips. Every person is created and being as a creation, as a nivra, has a nivra by definition, something that's created is finite because it was created in a specific time or space. Therefore, its potential is finite. There are two elements where there's an expression of somewhat our infinite creative ability. The koyach ein sof, the power of infinity, and the power of boira, of creation, is reflected in two parts of our body. The most simple place where it's reflected in our body is, and this is with all living beings, is in the procreative organ, which is, that's the koyach of ein sof, yes, the koyach, the power of infinity, which is that being who we are in our finite life form that we exist in, we can actually create new life. And this new life will create new life. The way the Yerushalmi says that something is called kayama b'min and kayama b'ish. Kayama b'min means the survival of the species. Kayama b'ish means survival of self. So there's not the survival of self as we define self in our particular body, but through the procreative action, we actually give something of ourselves, and in this process of giving something of ourselves, we're reflecting a koyach ein sofius, an infinite power that will allow for this to create this, and that will create that, and the other thing will create the other thing, and further on. One child will create the child, and child will create the grandchild, etc., etc. Which is what it says in Chassidus. That's the koyach ein sof. That's the koyach ein sof. The koyach of infinity is reflected in the power of our procreative organ. Just like there is the creative power, the creator's power, because there's creation and creator. Creation is finite. In the finite world, we're created and we're just a recipient of life. And being a recipient of life, we receive what we have to receive, and we live and then we die. Being a creator, or having a koyach ein sofius, having an infinite part of the creator process within us, allow us to recreate life, to co-create our life. This is reflected in the middle column of your body, both in the lower part of the body, which allows for physical existence to be created, and also in the higher part of the body, which is the mouth, the lips. The mouth also has life and death. It depends on a person's language. The power of speech is the power of is the creative power. This is the Baal Shem has spoken about this many, many times, and we spoke about it in great length previously. The whole idea of Bar Avagavra, that the idea of speaking, languaging things, gives life. Not only is it creative, but in its creativity is in terms of its what it's lifting a person or putting a person down, but it also gives context to our life. To say a little different. There is the way we language our lives, the way we monologue our lives internally, the way we speak about our lives, is the way we actually relate to our life. If a person is going through a hard experience and speaks it and says, I'm going through a very difficult experience, that in itself defines the experience. The languaging of the experience gives it the context which allows us to interpret the experience exactly how we define it through our language. So language is the creative process of language, is the way we create reality. Therefore, certain people, the famous example of this is the Eskimos and have over 20 words for snow, because there's to a person that's living in the West or that experiences snow once or twice a year or a few times a year, snow is snow. It's all the same thing. But a person that's living very much in tune with the rhythms of what snow represents defines it very differently, and therefore has a certain different type of reality and reaction, because they created a certain context to what that snow represents and what it is. So there's a creative process within language, and a creative process within creation. Now, this is where it's mizbata, this is where it's manifest, which means the koyach ein sof, the infinite power of the creative power, not the creation power, the creative power, that we hold within us. Where is it reflected? It's reflected either in the words that we say and how we say it and how we language it. And that's the way we create our reality. And that's what Tefilah is about, according to the Baal Shem, right? We get it. You connect to the Or, and through the words you speak in creation, and you're creating the reality. That's one way, through speech, and it's also through the procreative creating. Comes along the Baal Shem and says that the truth is that the real koyach, the real power of the creativity, actually lies not in the words themselves and not in the procreative action itself, but actually lies in the thought process. Actually lies in the mind, in the machshav, in the thought process of a person. And the thought is really where all the magic happens, where all this creative potential happens. And your creative power is reflected outwardly, externally, through speech and through the procreative action. And he gives an example. He says, for example, when you talk about the procreative action, he says that a person that has no thought to be intimate will not be able to be intimate. Which means there has to be a thought that allows and triggers a certain reaction in the body that allows a person to be procreative. And without that, therefore, without that process, you can't create. So everything exists within the mind. Then he gives another example in the reverse, not without, but with. That when you create something, and when you're procreating literally a child, so the Gemara talks about, Chazal talk about this idea, the Gemara talks about 9 to 5 children. In the Dharma, the end of the Perek and Daf Chav, the Gemara talks about something that's called a ben Tamura. What's a ben Tamura? A child of exchange. What's a child of exchange? A child of exchange means that when a person was intimate with their spouse, in the act of intimacy, instead of focusing and having their attention on the person that they were with, their intention and their mind was on somebody else, God forbid. And the child that would be created from this intimate act, from this creative act, will be a child that's an exchange child, which means there's a certain alignment that is happening between the male and female that's happening. It's allowing for this creative process to be revealed, for this creation to be revealed. And if God forbid, there is not a full alignment with the way the Zohar says of mind, heart, and soul and body, that there's some type of disconnect in this relationship, the child that's going to be born is going to be born a little bit disaligned. It's called a ben Tamura. The Megillah Mukas reveals something very powerful and profound. It's based on Midrashim, but that when Yaakov was with Leah for the first time, he thought it was Rachel, because in the morning it says V'hini Leah. He wakes up in the morning and he sees that it's Leah. So therefore, and Reuven, the child that was born, even though in Ishmasab and Bil and Shina, that even though that generally doesn't happen, but Reuven is called Reishis Oini, the first omission, which means that Reuven was conceived that night. And the Megillah Mukas says, therefore, you see that Reuven was, of course, we're talking about Shiftei Kar, we're talking about the highest level of tzaddikim, but the way the Megillah Mukas says this is that you see that Reuven was a little bit misaligned. That in the Torah speaks about Reuven is he wants to save his brother Yosef in slavery, but he shows up a little bit late. He wants to exchange the beds for a positive reason, so Yaakov should be with his mother, but he does something that's a little bit misaligned. You see that there's a certain type of misalignment. Then eventually, Reuven is once the tribe of Reuven once apart in Eretz Yisrael, but Me'aver Layam across the river, which means it's a misaligned. It's almost there, but it's misaligned. You also see this, by the way, the Megillah Mukas says this happens with God, because the Medrash HaGadol, the Medrash says that Zilpah really, there's no reason for Yaakov to be with Zilpah, because Bila, the reason was because Rachel couldn't have children, so she gave her maidservant to Yaakov, so she'd have children. So maybe she'll have children from her, and they'll be like children from me because she was her maidservant. Why was Yaakov together with Zilpah? So the Medrash says that actually Bilhah dressed Zilpah up in her own garments, and therefore, when they had a child, the child that was born, conceived on that treason or that ruse, was called God, Ba-God, and Gad actually means treason, which means Yaakov was not aware. The same thing, and that's why Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven are also across the river. So this is a Bnei Tmura, which means that really, what the Baal Shem is saying is that really everything starts in the mind. What you have in the mind really affects how it's going to be expressed, and the creation that's being expressed. So the machshava, the koyach hachachma, the koyach machshava, the power of the thought, is where the creative ability exists, and the haylada, the tolda, the child that's born, whether it's a literal child or the world of speech, is the bitui, is the manifestation of that creative process. Incidentally, it's important to understand this. I spoke about this once in the past, and I think it's written about in one of the books, that that not only is a ben Tamura created literally when a husband and wife are together, and they're not thinking about, they're not aligned on their level of their thoughts and their heart and their body are not aligned together. And in a case where there's an actual child that's conceived that evening, but the truth is that every time there's a relationship, certainly a deep physical, intimate relationship between the spouses, there's always something that's being created. The Zohar speaks about malachim that are being created, angels that are created, or neshamas that are created, souls that are being created. And to translate that on a very, very simple level, it's you're creating a certain environment, a certain type of energy in the room. You know, if not to get off topic, but if spouses are wondering why there's a type of misalignment in their relationship, in day-to-day relationship, it's because when they were intimate, they created a certain energy, a certain malach, a certain angel, a certain soul that was created in every single type of this relationship. There's angels and souls are being created that lives. That's a present consciousness that lives in the home that causes a disalignment. So it's very important to always be not only in intimate moments, but anytime you're intimate with a person. Anytime you're having a room with a beres and b'shuk, anytime you're speaking to someone and you're really having an intimate moment, you should really be present with them. Otherwise, you're creating negative energy, a negative, misaligned energy that, because of that, you feel misaligned and out of place. Anyways, this is what the Baal Shem is saying, that there's a type of creative process. So now let's go back to speech. So this is what happens when a person is moitzeh Allah Ta'ala. A person is waste their seed. They're taking this creative process, this possibility of koyach ein sofius, the power of infinity that exists within them, and what they're doing is they're releasing it, and there's no receiver, there's no recipient, and it's wasted. It's a wasted seed. That's, God forbid, when a person wastes their seed. So it's not only you're wasting your physical energy of the body, you're wasting a koyach ein sof. You're wasting something that has infinite potential, and you're wasting it on momentary pleasure, maybe. This is the tragedy of wasting seed. But then the Baal Shem says it's the same thing also with thoughts and words. When a person speaks, so there's various different levels of speech. There is obviously holy speech, meaningful speech, intentional speech. And there's also, God forbid, there's the opposite of that. A person can speak lashon hara, a person can speak evil about another person and speak negatively about another person. Baal Shem is not talking about that. This is not a conversation about lashon hara, about negative speech. It's talking about dvarim betelim. You're speaking nonsense, silliness, meaningless words. So what you're doing is you're taking the koyach that you have to mizbata, to manifest, because you can't speak words without thought, and out any thought, because even everything that comes out of your mouth had a subconscious thought. You once had that thought somewhere. You can't say something if you didn't think it first. But when you're speaking empty words with not a thought process there's no vested, conscious, mindful thought within the words that you're speaking now. What you're doing is you're taking your chayas, your life force, which we learned previously that Baal Shem Tov spoke in great length, that the koyach of a person's aliveness is reflected in a person's breathing. Obviously, that's literal, and reflected in a person's speaking. You're taking it and you're wasting it. So he's not saying something against. Of course, you shouldn't speak lashon hara. That's not a question. But the question is, even just wasting your words, a person wasting their words, they're taking something that has the power to hold Ein Sof, infinite power, to contextualize life in a very holy and a meaningful way, and you're wasting it. Now, sometimes Dvarim B'Telem, it's important to understand this. Dvarim B'Telem, like wasteful words, again, it's not lashon hara, it's not evil words, it's not holy words. It's just Dvarim B'Telem, it's just wasted words. Sometimes people feel the need to break the silence, to fill it with noise. Like sometimes you're in a situation where it's maybe a little uncomfortable, so you just fill the space with noise, and somehow that's better than being in a place of silence. And also, no, it's actually much worse. What you're doing is you're wasting the koyach ein sofi that you have. You're wasting real spiritual raw power that has potential to create and to be creative, and you're ruining it. Now, sometimes to fill out this whole conversation, sometimes speaking dvarim b'telem, wasteful words, quote unquote wasteful words, which doesn't seem to have any meaning, could be beneficial and helpful for the person that you're speaking to. So you're doing a kindness to the person. There's a famous story, or a story that's told about Rabbi Sol Salanter. Now it's the month of Elul. Say the story. It's a nice story that Rabbi Sol Salanter, the great tzaddik, the Musar tzaddik, that and a profound thinker. Rabbi Sol Salanter was once, during the month of Elul, didn't speak. Did a tainas dibur. It's a custom by many Mekubalim. With a tainas dibur, he fasted from speaking, which means speaking mundane speech. And it was Erev Yom Kippur, which means that it was 40 days that he's been very, very careful to speak only holy words, only sacred words, only words that he really needs to speak, and not talk trivial words. I'm sure he never spoke to HaTefilah. Certainly in this time period, he refrained from that. And he's walking down the street. He's ready with his kittel and his talis, and he's walking Yom Kippur, and it's like the holiest day, the highest time, the time of ultimate intimacy. Yom Chasanasa is Ma'an Torah. This is like the highest day of intimacy. Luchas Hashoynes, Luchas Shnias. And he's about to get to shul, and as he's walking to shul, he's walking with one of his students, and another person walks over to him, a very simple person, a simpleton, walks over and starts talking to Risal Salanter about nonsense. In a colloquial way, in a modern way, let's say, he starts talking to him about sports, which is just talking about noise. And he starts telling him, this team won and that team won, and this is the score. And Risal Salanter is like really engaged in the conversation. He's like, oh, really? They won? How did they win? And who hit the home run? And he starts talking to this fellow, and his student looks at his rabbi, his teacher. The man didn't speak for 40 days. And here he's like, right before Yom Kippur, he's sitting and talking the most trivial and nonsensical and meaningless words. Of course, he didn't ask his rabbi during Yom Kippur, but after Yom Kippur, he asked Rabbi Sol Salanter, he said, Rabbi, how could you, he doesn't understand, for 40 days you were careful not to speak these words, and then right before Yom Kippur you were speaking to this Jew, and he told him that for this Jew, his chayas, his life, he lived with these things. This is what gave him chayas. He was a very simple person. So for me, I was doing him a kindness. So sometimes speaking dvarim b'telem, even wasteful words, or seemingly wasteful words, if you do it tailored to the individual person, through that you're giving him chayas, through that you're giving him life, through that maybe you can slip in a word of a meaningful word. So it's not just a blanket statement against dvarim b'telem. I mean, of course, it is in a larger sense, but the nekuda is that we always have to be careful and be mindful. This is the point. We always have to be mindful that we have tremendous power, both in the creative process, literally in the creative process of creating life, whether it's literally a child or creating life in our home, in the place of our relationships. We're creating a life, and to make sure that it's always aligned, and it's always intentional, and God forbid it's never levatala, never without a recipient. And also, in all of life, in every aspect of life, every time we speak, we should be conscious that we're using a tremendous tool, a tool that can hold infinite power of contextualization and creativity, and we make sure that we use it correctly and not, God forbid, waste it, and that would be very tragic. You should have a wonderful week.